Well, thank you very much, Guru, for your nice introduction. And it's very nice to be here. It's very nice to be given the chance, actually, thanks to your initiative, to actually get back to studying this manuscript, which I actually discovered rather a long time ago. And I've been meaning to look at it properly again. And so this is my plan for the present and for the future. Anyway, the longer you were talking, the more time it gave everyone to see there's an S missing there. But anyway, what can you do? I'm sure Shah Abbas's architects would have spotted that immediately and put it right. Well, I've got a paper here to read, and I'll do that. I'm very glad, as I say, to have the chance to get back to this topic, because the manuscript in question, which I'm going to describe in a bit more detail, is really rich, not only in information, of course, about Shah Abbas, but it really illuminates the fact that Safavid Iran, it seems to me, is a sort of linchpin of international relations during this period, because, of course, not only are we looking west of the Ottomans, which is relatively well known, but the interactions with Iran and Central Asia as well, of course, are very important at this time, and they're very richly documented in this source as well, with numerous documents and texts, which I think throw some new light on the question. So essentially, the work is worth studying in enormous detail, and not simply for the parts that I'm going to talk about now. So I'm very glad to be here, although I don't, despite some of my recent works, regard myself as a historian of architecture or of art. So it's a great leap of faith of you to invite me to the Aga Khan program. And of course, being a specialist in Iran as well, I feel that I've entered a realm where Turkish predominates. So it's very nice to have a chance to wave the Iranian equivalent of the Union Jack. This leads me to a sort of second confession, the first being the third confession, the first being that I can't spell, and the second that I'm not really a historian of architecture, and the third really is that the new light was originally going to focus more on Shah Abbas and the chronicle of his reign than on the construction of Isfahan itself. And the reason is that the original intention was that the chronicle that I had the good fortune to find some time ago, and which is the basis of my talk, was going to provide large quantities of new data on Abbas's building program in Isfahan. This was the idea, you see, because it produces so much other new information. But despite some substantial materials, much of which, in fact, I've already recorded in a previous article, this turns out to be not entirely the case. I mean, this isn't just bursting at the seams with new information about Shah Abbas's construction of Isfahan. However, the more my reading progresses, and I have to say that although I've been here 10 weeks or something already, I still haven't finished even the basic job of going through the whole chronicle. The more I see that the information I have found is not without interest. A survey of these passages does not provide very easily digestible fare for an audience who are not necessarily versed in the material currently available. In other words, if I says he says this and he says that and he says that, it's useful to know what everyone else says as well, and to have gone richly into all this. Perhaps it's more suitable for a seminar. But still, I hope to provide a sense of the scope provided by this material for further research. And indeed, there are many other things to be found in the chronicle in question that will be of interest to historians of Islamic architecture. But they not only concern Isfahan, there are other important building complexes, especially in Ardabil, Farrahabad, which unfortunately, of course, has largely disappeared, and in Mashhad, which time does not permit me to go into here. I shall draw attention very briefly to some of this information about Ardabil, because I can't resist it, because actually it's got some fantastic information about Ardabil if we have time. But in fact, a plug for a lecture I'm going to give in Yale on the 25th of April. I shall be talking about that. So if anyone wants a short bus ride to Yale, you'll get a chance to listen to me twice in 1 month. Anyway, so that's just by way of introduction. So for those of you who are only vaguely aware of what I might be talking about, I must introduce the chronicle in question. It's called the Afzal al-Tawarikh, or Afdal al-Tawarikh, the most excellent of histories. And its author, Fadli Beg Khuzani Isfahani. I must introduce him as well. How this manuscript which is called D5.6, came to be sitting in the library of Christ College, Cambridge, which is a beautiful picture of the old library. The old library of Christ College, Cambridge would make an interesting presentation on its own. Almost every step can be traced of its journey from Iran, where of course it started to be written, to Cambridge via India. And these are some of the stages. I mean, of course, it can be traced partly through sales catalogues and partly through the stickers on the manuscript itself. So I'm going to mention some of these as we go along. And there are one or two gaps still. But actually, this sort of thing is absolutely fascinating, I think, just the life of a book and how it moves around and who's owned it and how it gets to where it's been. And we'll see that it's not just the Europeans who've made these interventions, but the author himself. Leaving aside for now where it was written and created, that's to say by the author, to concentrate on the second part of its existence, it was first purchased by Jean-Baptiste Gentil, who was his dates were 1726 to 1799, who was in India from 1752 to 78 in the French army. He served in Faizabad for 12 years till 1775, and in fact this might be significant because there's only one other recorded manuscript of this chronicle, and it's supposed to be in a library in Faizabad. I mean, I've never had any success in finding it, and the library, I didn't even know if the library still exists, but nevertheless there is a recorded copy of the Afdal Tabarik in Faizabad still, or there was. Well, in Faizabad, he came under the protection of Shujaa-ud-Dawla, who was the governor of Oud, or Awad, the Grand Vizier of the Mughal Sultan Shah Alam II. On the vizier's death, Gentil was obliged by the English to move to Chandernagore, where the governor was Jean-Baptiste Chevalier de Conon, who is our second hero, who was governor there from 1770 to 1779. Gentil had previously been able to acquire for him Persian manuscripts that came from the Mughal library in Delhi and send them from Faizabad. Whether he continued to acquire them for himself or for Chevalier is not certain. In the case of our manuscript, Gentil's seal is clearly seen on the fly sheet. This is there. That's actually a bit clearer down there. But was among 69 manuscripts offered for the sale in Paris as part of the collection of Chevalier after his death in 1789. His governorship of Chandernagore ended a year after Gentil left India in 1778, and presumably it was he, that's say Chevalier, rather than Gentil, who brought the manuscripts back to Paris as his own property. In the sale of Chevalier's library, which is the 9th of July 1789, the date may be sort of a bit resonant of other events. The future manuscript was number 15, and it was identified like this. Al-Amara Abbasi, Histoire de Shah Abbas, 2 rois de Perse par Mirza Khan, son secrétaire, on 1035 Hijra Isfahan. And this is also what's written up there, which is rather faint, but it's the same. So this was Gentil's label, as this is found on the label at the front of the manuscript. And 2 other manuscripts with Gentil's seal and his characteristic label are now found in the Christ College collection. The purchasers of the Gentil or Chevalier manuscripts in 1789 are not known, but there's a very strong likelihood that the manuscript was bought by someone called John Haddon Hindley, who was the next attested owner. This in itself is not conclusive, for he could have purchased it from an intermediate third party. However, the catalogue of Hindley's books and manuscripts offered for sale in 1793, 4 years later, also included another collection of Persian manuscripts made by the late French governor of Chandernagore. You can read that up here, i.e. Chevalier. Possibly Hindley had acquired Chevalier's collection en masse and kept its identity separate from his own library, or maybe the events of July 1789 forced the withdrawal of the sale in Paris, and Chevalier's heirs sought a more stable market in London. This might also explain why the 5 manuscripts from this sale that are now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France did not enter the collection until some time later. the description of the manuscript is essentially the same as that in the French sale catalogue. Let's say it's down here, number 1238. It's item number 1238. It was purchased for £1, 5 and 6pence, which was a pretty good bargain by somebody whose name I can't read. I think it could be Gosset, but I'm not certain. He bought a few other things as well. If anyone's got a better idea what that says, I'd be very grateful. Strangely, he does not seem to have kept his purchase, or if he did so, it was later recovered by Hindley, for we find pasted on the fly sheet a label that reads, I have to go back a couple to show you where this is. This is up here, and in fact it's back to front, so you have to look at it in the mirror. This manuscript belongs to theologian T.H. Hindley of Brasenose College, Oxford, and Christ Church College, Manchester, 1803. So he owned it again in 1803, having it been part of his sale in 1793. Hindley, 1765 to 1827, was known in Manchester for his querulous temper as the Book of Lamentations, and he died a bachelor, having long laboured under a mental infirmity. Nevertheless, he was of a scholarly inclination and certainly knew Persian, though Charles Rieux comments that he never acquired more than a very elementary knowledge of either Arabic or Persian. He published Persian lyrics from the Divan-i-Hafiz in 1800 and edited something called the Pende Attar in 1809. After his death, his manuscripts, which were mainly transcriptions, were presented to the British Library in 1829. That's why Rieux mentions them, because he goes at the beginning of his catalogue through the source of most of the collections. Although they are of little interest, the best having already been sold. One that belonged to Samuel Guise also entered the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris from the library of Jules Moll. This was a Psalmnameh, and it's quite an interesting book. At all events, Hindley had a second sale of his books on the 6th of June 1805, in which number 310 was our manuscript, Al-Amarai Abbasi, with a slightly different description, the history of Persia from the beginning of the empire of the Sefi family to Shah Abbas the Cruel, by Mirza Khan, written in a good Talik hand and in excellent condition. Now, this manuscript was bought by someone called Mr. Hall, which you can't quite read there. It just says ditto, but that's because he bought several other things, whom I've been unable to identify. Although he must have had a significant library, since he seems to have bought most of Hindley's Persian manuscripts. And here it was sold for £5, 15 and 6, so that's quite a decent increase in price over a short period, £4 something extra. Anyway, here the trail goes dead, and I've not been able to determine whether John Hutton of Mask, who was the final owner, that's his bookplate. Mask is somewhere in North Yorkshire, brought the manuscript straight from Hall or from some intervening parties, and nor when it was acquired. There are various notes in all these things, and in fact some of his manuscripts do have a pencil note written on the date he acquired it, but I can't find any correlation with the sale of Persian manuscripts in London for these dates. And he seems to have spent his whole life in Yorkshire, so it's quite difficult to see quite how it ended up there. Hutton's younger brother Timothy presented it to Christ College in 1861. The description of the manuscript developed slightly from the time of its purchase by Chantil or sale by Chevalier, perhaps reflecting an improved knowledge of Persian history and historical writing, so that in the end it was briefly described by E.G. Browne as the second Sahifa of the Al-Amarai Abbasi of Iskandar Munshi, containing the reign of Shah Abbas the Great in clear Indian ta'liq. Thus, the erroneous reference to Abbas II has gone, and the epithet cruel has been changed to great. The author's name is more correctly given as Iskandar Munshi. But Browne makes no reference to the date of the manuscript, which is wrongly given as 1035 in the earlier lists. One has the feeling that the manuscript remained a collector's item, that none of those who possessed or listed it, including the supremely qualified Professor Browne, ever read it with any attention. Had they done so, they might have noticed it's not the Al-Amarai Abbasi at all, but a much rarer work. In short, the manuscript is the third volume of a little-known chronicle of the first Safavids, who ruled Iran from 1501 to 1722, Like the other two volumes, which cover respectively the reigns of Shah Ismail I and Shah Tahmasp, both of which happen to be in England, it is a unique copy. In other words, there are 3 volumes of this thing known. They all only exist in a single copy. 2 of them are in Cambridge, I'm happy to say, and 1 of them is in London. It deals, that's our manuscript, deals with the long and crucial reign of Shah Abbas, who ruled from 1587 to 1629, in very great detail. It has 759 folios, which is 1,156 pages. The author, whose name is given in an erased passage on folio 20, up here, it's his name. It's erased because this is a feature of the book. It's all been stuck together later, and this passage is repeated earlier, and so he's crossed it out now, and there's obviously been some manipulation of the text. He belonged to a well-established family of bureaucrats and officials, the Khuzani family, and the work contains many references to other members of the family. He was born in 1593 and served in various capacities in the provincial administration, notably for 6 years in the Caucasus, which accounts for the enormous wealth of data on the province and the Safavid campaigns in Georgia. I mean, this is really, even if there's nothing else in the chronicle, it would be an incredible source of information about these campaigns in the Caucasus, where he was the vizier to the governor. Falling from office with the governor in 1625, he gained a post in Kerman. After the death of Shah Abbas in 1629 and the political purges that soon followed the accession of his grandson Safi I, Fazli Beg left Iran for the Deccan in India, now in his early 40s. He had relatives there, actually, an uncle, quite a famous diplomat, Zain al-Khan, and his son also followed him there, and he wrote a chronicle called Akhbar al-Tiraz, I think, which happens to be in the British Library as well. You do have to be jolly glad about the way the English strutted around the universe in the 17th and 18th century, because otherwise all these things have probably been destroyed by worms by now. Anyway, well, in the Deccan, he continued to work on his chronicle, which was evidently never completed, and hence its disappearance from Persian historiography. In other words, he wasn't writing in Iran. No one really knew about this. His work isn't cited by any later authors, so it's sort of frozen in time in the Deccan until it was purchased by these French officials. So with your indulgence, before coming to discuss some of the contents of this work that bear on Shah Abbas's patronage of architecture, I need to say a little bit more about the state of the text as we now have it, which partly explains the persistent misidentification of the work. I mentioned that it was not completed. In fact, all 3 volumes are in some way defective and bear the signs of continuous revision. The misidentification of the manuscript is not surprising, given that the first 2 pages are indeed copied from Fazli Beg Munchi's, Iskandar Beg Munchi's Al-Amarai Abbasi. So this is on fresh paper, and this actually is the beginning of Al-Amarai Abbasi. Probably the beginning of the manuscript had disappeared, together with the title of the work, and since it was clear that the book concerned the history of the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas, the gap was made good at the time of the sale to Jean-Baptiste Gentil from the well-known chronicle of Iskandar Beg. At the same time, the surviving opening passages of the work were recopied in order to join up with the original surviving text on folio 4 recto. So in other words, it's pretty clear from here, because obviously there are more lines on the, this is different. This paper's different. There's no marginal ruling. The number of lines are different. And so this is not Iskandar Beg, but it's carried through to a point where it joins up again with the original manuscript. So probably the first few pages were very damaged, and it was recopied to make a nice purchase for the French collector. Similar problems seem to beset the other 2 volumes. Volume 1 on Shah Ismail seems to be a complete finished copy with hardly any marginal additions, but it is a composite text put together from perhaps various versions, as it is in the hand of several different scribes and irregularly bound. You can tell this because the gatherings are very irregular. Normally there's 8 folios in a gathering, and it varies enormously. And you can plot these against changes of handwriting and awkward sort of manipulations of the text. The first 10 folios of Volume 1 are in a completely different hand from what follows. Well, this is, that's 11, and this is 10 verse. And this introductory material has evidently been added later in the reign of Shah Safi, as is evident from the use of Indian historical sources listed by Fazli on folio 2 verse. So in this part, which I say is new and later, he refers to sources written in India, which he clearly wouldn't have been using while he was in Iran. Volume 2 on Shah Tahmasp is particularly valuable because it's in the author's hand, apart from the first folio, in which it is written that the section on the rulers after Tahmasp will follow next. In fact, that's what one would expect. You'd expect this as Volume 2, and Volume 3 is going to follow later. In contrast to Volume 1, therefore, this opening passage is presumably the survival of an earlier draft rather than a later addition. So this is the join between the first folio, well, the first folio is blank, and then it's folio 2 verse, and then folio 3 recte. You see it's in rather a poor state. This is the one in the British Library. Fazli's hand is very distinctive. In fact, this is his hand, but there's a better look at it there, which allows us to identify the authorial interventions in the margins of the volume 3 on Shah Abbas, let's say our chronicle. So it's really nice to know that the marginal notes, or a lot of the marginal notes, are actually written in the author's own hand, because we have the author's hand from volume 2. The manuscript, as I say, in the British Library, was copied in Golconda in the Deccan in 1049, 1639. This is written down here, again in the author's rather distinctive hand. It's got the date, and he was in Golconda. So the interesting thing is that that is 9 years after our volume, which I think was written in 1040. Which I'd be quite glad to know. I originally read that as 1045. If the experts here think that's 1040 or 1045. It was written, if you remember, in the sale catalogue as 1035. So there's a reasonable doubt over that. Anyway, I'm now sticking to 1040, but whatever it was, this is a fair copy, as we'll see, and it was clearly produced before the author's own copy of Volume 2. So, I mean, even just from that, you can see that there's a complicated creation of the effort to create a final version of this work. I can and have said much more about the very complicated process of the compilation of these volumes. In several of them, he says, I've done this one, and now I'm going to do that one, and then, and then another party says, I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to do that. And this is spread out all over all 3 volumes. So he was clearly working on it all the time. Suffice it to say in summary that whatever the order in which Fazli worked on the different volumes of his chronicle, it was not completed by the time he moved to India, early in the reign of Shah Safi, and he continued to edit the work with new introductory pages in Volume 1, to recopy it himself in 1639, Volume 2, and revise an earlier copy of his own text, Volume 3, at various times referring to the fact that all this was being done in the reign of Shah Safi. Among the marginal notes are many documents concerning relations with the Uzbeks and the Mughals, which still await analysis. What we have, therefore, is a fascinating work in progress, being compiled far from Iran and allowing for many interesting changes and additions to the text. And some of them are quite simple, just people's titles have been taken out. So instead of being Khilafat Panah, he's just who he is, and he's no longer the sort of refuge of the caliphate and things like this. So he's having a chance to get a dig in at some of his foes. Well, I hope that's interesting. The point is, this is really an extraordinary chronicle. It's very long, it's very rich, and it's got a huge amount of material which has barely been touched. I mean, quite frankly, even though I announced this to the world several years ago and it's been microfilmed and, I mean, people can freely get it, nobody's really used it. And I think personally that it will transform our knowledge of Safavid Iran in the period of Shah Abbas, and particularly with the detail of names and provincial officials, because he's really into the bureaucracy, and every page there are lists of people who've done this, and everywhere Abbas went, we see that he changed the darughas, the kalantars, I mean, just extraordinary level of detail into the provincial administration. Well, I know you didn't come here to listen to this. You want to know about Safavid Isfahan. And so I'm going to turn to that now. As far as Isfahan is concerned, the obvious starting point is Robert McChesney's seminal article, 4 Sources on Shah Abbas's Building of Isfahan, which made accessible the descriptions of his development of the city in Natanz's Naqavat al-Asar, Munajim Yazdi's Tarikh Abbasi, Iskandar Beg's celebrated Alam Arai Abbasi, already mentioned, and Junabadi's less well-known Rosetta Safavier. 2 of these texts have been made more accessible since Robert's article in 1988 by the publication of printed editions. And as he noted, the 3rd volume of Fazli Isfahani's Afzal al-Tawarikh, if located, may also provide new information about Abbas's great urban design. Well, let's see. In the course of what follows, I'll be putting up some of the passages in the manuscript from which I was working until very recently. But since coming here, I have been most fortunate in being able to consult the draft printed text being prepared for publication by my colleague Kiyumas Gereglu, which has made my task very much simpler. Secondly, for all the great wealth of information it contains, Fazli Beg's chronicle provides very few dates and follows the flawed chronological system, or lack of it, to which Robert McChesney drew attention many years ago, that is used by Iskandar Beg Munshi, which tries unsuccessfully to combine the Hijri lunar calendar with the 12-animal solar calendar, together with the regnal year of the Shah. I mean, in fact, the chronology is a shambles. Fazli Beg was no venerable Bede, and events or information that he places in one annal are often reported by Iskandar Beg and other sources in a different year. There are very few ways to control this, and anyway, there's no guarantee that dates, when they are given, are reliable. For now, it's enough to observe that some of Fazli's information departs quite significantly from that given by Iskandar Beg, the main contemporary source for the reign of Shah Abbas. With these points in mind, let's start with the development of Isfahan. First, it's noteworthy that unlike all later authors, Fazli confirms the early interest of Abbas in developing Isfahan that was reported by Natanzi. In 1590, the Shah went to Isfahan and stayed at the Naqshi Jahan palace created by Shah Ismail and drew up plans for buildings and gardens. Okay, it's a very short account, but it shows right at the start of his reign, he started to plan the development of the city. I've got a few just to ease you on the eye. Of course, it didn't look like that at the time, but that's what it looks like now. 3 years later, in 1592, Abbas was again in the city and bestowed many attentions on the people, granting a 1-year remission of taxes. He drew up a, this is also not how it was like there at the moment, like at the time. He drew up a plan for the building of, and there's, we've got out of the order here. Unfortunately, I knew something was going to go wrong. I seem to have dropped a page, never mind. Do you mind if I just check if it's... Yeah, all right, forget it. That is annoying. Maybe that's it. Unfortunately, this is a blob. He drew up a plan for the building of the blob, and the Maidan and the Caesarea, that's the bazaar, and most interestingly, ordered that the old Caesarea, that's to say the bazaars around the Haruni Vilayat, should be destroyed. Okay, this is unique information. You might be able to read it here somewhere. But, of course, no one else says this. After touring and feasting in the gardens of Isfahan, he set off back to Qazvin for the winter. From this brief statement, which is not followed up later, we would conclude that Abbas's intention from the outset was a radical relocation of the center of the city's commercial activity. Only Junabadi gives a hint of the rivalries and opposition caused by the creation of Abbas's new quarter, but he does so in terms of Abbas's original intention to modernize and restore the old quarter, not to destroy it, being misconstrued by the powerful owners of the shops there, leading Abbas to desist from this plan and start afresh elsewhere. The following year, 1593, he entertained some Chingizid visitors, lodging them first in the Naqshi Jahan Palace in Isfahan, before quartering them in the house of Alpan Beg the Yasa'ul Bashi, a sort of aide-de-camp, while he hastened to his own quarters, which are described as imarat. As had been decreed, the best and the most of it, that's to say the palace, had by now been built. The Shah spent several days relaxing in Isfahan, and during that time drew up plans for the Chahar Bagh already, 1593, and the building of the Guldaste, which is a sort of tower in the palace gardens. The Shah brought Sheikh Lutfallah with him on the journey from Kazvin and drew up the plan for the mosque opposite the Ala Kapu Dolat Khane. I've got a nice picture of the mosque. Actually, I want to go back to that picture. It was in the right place after all. Overseers were appointed to bring it to completion and call it the Masjid-i Sheikh Lutfullah. The great Sheikh himself was appointed to supervise the rooms. We're on this page now. And the nighttime prayer halls, the Shabistans, and the places allocated for ascetics and worshippers. After it was completed, the Friday prayer and other religious obligations would be performed there, and it was decreed that, for the renewal of the performance of retreat and worship, a sum be allocated for the needs of this mosque from each of the incomes of the properties and commercial establishments of the Khase, that's the private purse of the Shah. And every year the tax collectors of the settlements around Isfahan would give the amount requested by the refuge of the Sidaret, i.e. the Sheikh, Sidarat, the Sheikh. The Caesarea and the Chahar Bazaar, which had been founded beforehand, were half finished. More planners then came to the Shah's attention, and they organized a hammam in the Guldaste. Unfortunately, prostitutes and singers were then given permission on the orders of Alpan Beg to entertain the Chingizid sultans. So all this is here. And it's rather an important description. Even if this account is even remotely accurate, it not only provides evidence missing elsewhere that Sheikh Lutfullah was indeed associated with the construction and even the design of the mosque from the outset, but that this development occurred a decade earlier than is usually assumed. There are inscriptions from 1012, this is 1002 Hijri, that would seem to argue in favor of the later date. There are disagreements with the other sources used in Robert's article, and another radical divergence of dates will be noted in a moment. Nevertheless, his account contains specific details not reported elsewhere. It's noteworthy that the information is provided in one of Fazli's later marginal glosses. So, in fact, most of the information about the Sheikh Lutfullah Mosque is down there in his own characteristic handwriting. An even more original and unique report is given under the year 1598, the year generally accepted as being when Isfahan became officially the capital and replaced Kazvin. The Shah entered the city, and as always, Fazli provides a long list of the senior officials who went out to greet him. Now I'm quoting, "The precious buildings for the Dolat Khane, the gardens, the hammams, the Chahar Khiyaban and the Souk, having been designed, problem-solving architects were appointed to bring them to completion." There's a bit of confusion. He sometimes called it Chahar Bagh, sometimes Chahar Khiyaban, sometimes Chahar Bazaar, sometimes the Souk. It's not always clear from his terminology if he's talking about what we would now, and of course sometimes he calls it the Caesarea as well, unfortunately. This would seem to infer that work was still continuing on these foundations, not that they were just being inaugurated at this time. In the margin, Fazli adds the following, "And the Shah went to a madrasa opposite the hammam at the end of the Chahar Souk, which is by the Caesarea and the Polo Maidan, beside the Ali Kapu, which would seem to me to put it somewhere in the northwest corner, and determined that, being drawn up according to the order of Maulana Abdullah Athani Shushtari, it should be completed." In other words, there was a madrasa already under construction. They made a water canal that ran from the Maidan and the Caesarea on the Naqshi Jahan, flow through the madrasa. This was begun on the Shah's orders, and in 2 years it was completed. A post was established for students and researchers according to the decision of the Refuge of Excellence, Maulana Abdullah, who would teach in that lofty dome every day. A place being assigned beside the mosque, it was determined that with the permission of the Divan, the clerks of the land holdings and commercial enterprises of the Khalise, which he himself had set up in Isfahan, should treat this as an important matter. It was known as the Madrasa of Maulana Abdullah, and the ulama and the fuzala prayed and studied and discussed learning there. So we're moving on. This is the unusual description of this building. And Stephen Blake's very useful book, he identifies it, I think it's either that one or that one. It seemed to me, because he mentioned the side of the AKPIA, it's more likely there, and the fact that there was this canal coming from that, well, I'm not sure. Anyway, I think it probably is there. But that's a unique description of the building of this building and its name for Shushtari. Blake considers Iskandar Beg refers to this madrasa without naming it under the year 1020 as having been built earlier on the eastern and northern side of the square. So I guess that's right. Shushtari actually died in the year that Iskandar Beg mentions. And as I say, Fazli's account of Abbas's efforts is quite different from anyone else's. So most people are charting the transformation of Qazvin from Isfahan, from the capital, from being Qazvin to being Isfahan this year. And in fact, all that Fazli says is the development of this particular madrasa. Fazli records the Caesarea and the Chahar Bazaar in the main Dan in Isfahan as recently completed in 1600. Abbas's efforts to develop the capital continued unabated. In 1603, he celebrated Nowruz in the city and then busied himself with the restoration of gardens and the establishment of buildings, striving for the increase of lofty structures. Casting his eye on the location that had been the old Dar al-Sultanah of the Seljuk Sultans of Iran, he put it in order, and buying many properties from the owners of those districts, he planned gardens and cultivations. The following year, 1604, Fazli records Abbas resettling the Armenians of Erivan, Julahi and Chukur Sa'ad, who had been earmarked for moving to Isfahan. The Shah instructed Mirza Muhammad the Vizier and Mir Jamal ad-Din Muhammad Sukhte of the Khalise administration to give a district for buildings and houses to those who were merchants, on the far side of the Zayindi Road, opposite the Tabrizi population. Fazli notes that 2 years earlier, that's 1602, according to royal command, Haji Inayatullah and Syed Hassan Mutafarrike Tabrizi had been brought from Iraq to draw up the plan for Abbas Abad. This is all complete, this isn't found anywhere else. Each of the groups mentioned, it's not clear here if they're the Tabrizis or the Armenians, unfortunately, was allocated 3, 10, or 20 jaribs, each jarib being 62 cubits, for building according to his needs. The Shah purchased the area for development from the Isfahani owners of the nearby Shamsabad and Bidistan and other villages and gave them the land. Each, according to his circumstances, spent from 3,000 to 100 tumans. I may have the text of this. Maybe not. No. Okay. It's pretty well illegible anyway. On construction, and 2,000 houses or more were planned on a grid with a street, and most of them having water running through the middle of the houses. Hammams and gardens were designed, and they strove to bring it to completion. Each of the Armenians built a house according to his circumstances and ability, and set up trade and managing their affairs. Khaji Safar and Khaji Nazar, who were kalantars and nobles among the Julahis, on entering Isfahan, came opposite the Tabrizi population, and they too built lofty buildings. They gave land and excellent properties in quarters near the city also for those who engaged in agriculture and cultivation, and arranged houses for them. So this is a very full description, really, relatively speaking. Of course, it doesn't tell us what the houses were like, but in terms of the level of detail and the people involved and the planning of the layout of a grid with the houses on them, I think it's information that isn't found in the other sources. So once more, Fazli is throwing new light on the development of this district and its timing. If correct, he shows that the Tabrizis were already there before the arrival of the Armenians in 1604, in the wake of the Ottoman wars in the west. Iskandar Munshi gives the date 1597, and Munajim Yazdi gives the date 1611 for development of Abbasabad. Fazli here splits the difference and once more provides details not found anywhere else. Robert McChesney does discuss this issue in his paper. According to the Afzal al-Tawarikh, the year 1607-8, not mentioned by any other source, was a critical one for Abbas's building ambitions. It contains accounts of works in Ardabil, Mashhad and Mazandaran, most of which I have to gloss over here. He returned from Mazandaran to Isfahan over the stone causeway across the Salt Desert, which had now been completed. You remember this was built so that Abbas could go on his pilgrimage on foot to Mashhad, which I wrote about several years ago. Once in the city, he was presented with a petition from Alaverdi Khan, governor of Fars, to build a bridge over the Zayindi Rood. Fazli clearly marks this as the Khan's initiative. All other sources mention the Shah's intention in giving the work to Alaverdi Khan to carry through. The Shah gave permission for the work to be started and every effort be made to complete it. In a marginal note, Fazli adds that the architectural work on that elevated construction should be entrusted to Mir Jamaluddin Muhammad Jabari, son of one of the great Isfahani families, and who was in the service of Alaverdi Khan. Good builders and carpenters with their tools were sought from the province of Fars and its environs. The plan of the building of the bridge is on 3 levels, or stories, such that the eyes of the beholders were astonished. No one had ever seen such a good building over the water, which could become a place for the world to stroll, Saygahi Alam, with structures that allowed people to decamp from their homes for a few days and nights and stay there without becoming weary of it. So perhaps we'd better go back to the picture. It was built of marble and yellow stone and other materials. I don't know if there are any experts here on buildings, but there's a word, yarqan, stone. It's a sort of, yarqan means yellow. I don't know if anyone knows if this is sort of a sandstone. There's another word, arbgé or abré, which is apparently a sort of stone, which the pen is powerless to describe. By the good fortune of the Shah, it took 5 years to complete. This account is interesting for a number of reasons. First, for the details of the architect previously unknown, and also for the date. Munajim Yazdi, essentially reliable with his chronology, he was an astronomer, puts this 5 years earlier in 1602. Iskandar Beg, much less reliable, and mashing everything together into a single account, puts it even earlier in 1598. Fazli's account is clearly linked to and a logical consequence of the development of the Abbasabad district on the other side of the river previously mentioned a year or two before. A factor supporting his chronology is the whole context of building work carried out by Abbas this year, as already mentioned, capped by his endowment of all his possessions to the 14 Immaculate Ones, described in massive detail by Fazli shortly afterwards. I'm not really going to have time to talk about this, but there are pages of the Waqf document for the Imams in this chronicle, and it's very, very interesting what he's giving, especially to the shrine at Ardabil and the arrangements being made for orphans and so on. But against his dating is the fact that he records the partial completion of the bridge next year. So one minute he says it takes 5 years to complete, and then the next year he says it was, anyway, almost ready. This would suggest that Munajim's account is more correct, although the Shah's impatience to see the work finished shines clearly through all these accounts. The bridge clearly became a major amenity even before its completion. Excuse me. We find Abbas himself enjoying it. The following year, in 1609, after more developments in Mazandaran, he returned to Isfahan, and here he spent several days touring the city and saw that work was in progress on the bridge, before going to inspect the site of his Kuhrang project, by which he hoped to divert water into the Zayindi Rood, which would more than double its flow. This is a separate issue, this great effort to divert the waters from the Zagros into the river, which actually he was unable to complete. The Shah was also found on the bridge discussing finances with the Etimad-e-Dowleh later this year. In other words, it says, the Shah was on the bridge when a message came. So he's clearly enjoying it, and there's clearly enough there for him to be on it, going about his daily business. Later in the autumn of the same year, that's to say the year after Fazli says it was commenced, a great feast was organized on the bridge to celebrate the fact that some of it was completed, anyway enough for it to be serviceable. For a week, the Shah relaxed and parted with the nobles and great ones of Isfahan, as well as the poor, the needy, and the rindan, the rins, the sort of vagabonds. Each level, I think I've got this text somewhere. Yeah, there we go. No. That's all, the texts have all disappeared. Never mind. Each level, soffet, and archway of the building above the bridge was assigned to one of the khatuns and sultans and intimates, muqarrab. Each was decorated from majlis to majlis and occasion to occasion, each one adorning the party face to face with each other. So that's to say, across the bridge, they're all having little sort of decorated niches. So it became the envy of the gardens of paradise. The Shah was again strolling on the bridge in the Nowruz holidays of 1610, urging the sultans and the pillars of state to arrange the buildings and gardens to develop and beautify the paradise-like city. And one of the things to say about Fazli's account is that every year something's happening. I mean, it's not just pushed together in one account. I mean, what we find with Iskandar Munchi's account is he has two great moments when he describes what's going on in Isfahan, one at the beginning and then one fairly soon at the end, and it's all sort of jumped up together. Fazli makes it clear that this was a sort of continuous process, really, and that the Shah was actively visiting. When he visited the city, he was actively doing something all the time. It was always Imarat and Baghat. Every visit, it was Imarat and Baghat going up. Whereas Munchi just says he went to Isfahan and spent the winter there and then went back to Qazvin, or then he went somewhere else. There was absolutely no information at all about the sort of regular enthusiasm, really. It sort of shines through these accounts that he was urging everybody on. He's constantly finding new architects. He's getting people to do a bit more designing. He was buying up plots of lands and giving it to people to make their dwellings and encouraging them to make lofty palaces. Compared with this level of information about the Shah's enthusiasm for the construction of his capital, the account Fazli gives of the founding of the Friday Mosque in the Maidan is disappointingly slight, though not without interest. He places this in the annal for 1612, although the chronogram he cites for the work by the poet Wafai yields the year before, 1611, which is as recorded by Munajim Yazdi and Iskandar Beg. So he says it occurred to the Shah to draw up plans for a Friday mosque opposite the Caesarea in the Dar Sultanate of Isfahan, which would remain a memorial, a yadigar of the mighty Padshah. For there was a mosque opposite the lofty Ala Kapu for the teaching of Sheikh Lutfullah, but nothing comparable for the Caesarea. And this suggests that the main aim was symmetry, actually. It wasn't some beautiful idea to have a mosque, but there was a mosque opposite the Ali Kapu, and there wasn't a mosque opposite the Caesarea. At an auspicious moment, the foundation of the lofty Masjid-i-Jami was laid. The oversight of the work, as everyone knows, was entrusted to Muhib Ali Beg, the tutor of the Ghulams. In a marginal note, Fazli observes that it was not completed by Abbas's death, but only in the reign of his successor, Shah Safi. Information about Isfahan dwindles from this point, and indeed Abbas's interests become increasingly preoccupied with other things, not least his development of the new royal establishments of Ashraf and Farahabad in Mazandaran. Nevertheless, I hope I've said enough to show that there is plenty of scope for further work here, not only in harmonizing the new data brought to the mix by Fazli, but also in his more general details of the personnel charged with running the city and the leading figures in the bureaucracy and the religious establishment, all of which can throw light on how the city worked. Well, you may think I'm going to stop there, but, but actually, well, there's another beautiful picture. Now, I just want to say something about Ardabil. Very briefly, turning briefly to the other main focus of Abbas's patronage in the first part of his reign, the Safavid dynastic shrine of Ardabil, and the neighbouring sanctuaries of Sayyid Jibra'il at Kalhuran and Shihabuddin at Aha. Fazli first mentioned the Shah's visit to Kalhuran in 1597, that's quite early on, after he had performed devotions in Ardabil. Zulfikar Khan was ordered to restore the buildings at Kalhuran under the supervision of the Khaseh. A more detailed report follows with Abbas's visit to Ardabil in 1605. After inquiring of each of his servants at the shrine in a friendly way, specifically he says he went up to all of them, everybody working there, and asked personally about their affairs, and bestowing many favours, the Shah went to Kalhuran and instructed Abbas Ali Sultan Shamlu, the new Mutawalli, to draw up plans for good buildings in the village of Kalhuran over the top of the grave of the noble Sayyids, who were the ancestors of that family. He also patronised the kitchen for the poor and attended to the distribution of alms for the deserving. There's some ambiguity as to whether Fazli is still referring to Kalhuran or back to Ardabil in this, because he's talking about developing a kitchen and so on, which is compounded by the next interesting passage. And having constructed the building of a Chini Khane and a library, which will be described at the time of their completion, he appointed Muradi, the excellent architect, previously unknown, to oversee the work of construction and quickly bring it to completion. He then seems to switch back to Kalhuran, but Abbas is leaving Ardabil from Aha. Anyway, the language here is a little bit complex, but this is clearly referring to Ardabil, and of course later, when it is completed, he does refer to the construction of the Chini Khane. He gives orders for another striking development at the shrine of Shihabuddin at Aha on his way by. Now, I haven't actually finished translating all this, but I just wanted to say about the Chini Khane, because he has a very long description of the construction of the Chini Khane, which is this, 2 years later, on a visit to Ardabil. And Munshi just says that the Shah went to Ardabil and did a ziyarat and then left. Fazli has this great long account of the building work there, and giving the measurements of the building. He organized the building of a Chini Khane with 4 layers, so that each the length of the building had various measurements, and there were different rooms, and he had cupboards, as we know, hollowed cupboards for the which like things, sort of niches that could be found in drapery shops and cloth merchants, and so on and so on and so on. And he mentions the books that were going to be given, and he mentions the famous curse also for the anyone who removed the book from the library. He actually has this in his chronicle. Here we have the date 1017. These are the books as is well known from Abbas's Waqf to the shrine at Ardabil, and it says that anyone can come and read these things, but if anyone takes them out, it's as though they participated in the blood of Hussein, which is a pretty potent curse. Anyway, he also says very interestingly that the inscriptions and the gilding over the alcoves and inside was done by Reza Abbasi, the famous Ali Reza Abbasi, the famous calligrapher. Anyway, this is just a small taster because, as I say, there's much very specific detail about the building of the Chini Khane. And then later, as I say, when he's describing the Waqf for the 14 immaculate ones, he has a very long passage on the benefits to Ardabil. So it's not just in Mashhad where we know that he was giving his properties and the shops and so on for developing the city, but all about the 40 girls and 40 boys and orphans who were having teaching every day. The master was appointed. There was food set up in a very regular way. If the girls, when they grew up, if someone wanted to marry them, he organized them getting married, and people who didn't want to join the shrine, they left and they were replaced by other people. So there were always 40 things. I mean, enormous detail. And it shows, of course, his great concern. And there's also a lot about his horses and the studs and how many mares there were and how many colts and the value of the whole thing. So what I'd really say from this, of course, it's not necessarily entirely new, is that Shah Abbas persistently pursued these things, and it wasn't a couple of sort of one-off gestures. The impression I get really from reading this is that he was at it the whole time and thinking the whole time about how best to develop the city. And of course, a similar amount of energy put into Ashraf and Mazandaran. We have some quite similar accounts of how he was allocating lands, he was getting the nobles to build their own palaces and laying out the city. And also other developments about the empire, some of which were made waqf to the shrine at Ardabil, particularly the development of the Bela Khan up in Karabagh, which was what would it have been, a summer quarters or a winter quarters? I want to know this. Anyway, pastures, summer quarters, I guess. Developing the building a water canal there and making the income from that a waqf to the shrine in Ardabil. And he did quite a bit of work that was restoring buildings that had been Ilkhanid and Chingizid buildings and which had fallen into ruin. One of them was Bela Khan itself, which actually was very heavily developed by Ghazan Khan. And another was the famous wall or dam between the Caspian gates, the Darband and the river Aras, which was a sort of barrier in which he said had been worn down by the constant passage of armies and the Kizilbash and the Ottomans and other destructive forces. And he was restoring it. And I think this shows his the concern to present himself as a restorer of a previous order. And he also has quite a lot to say about Timurid benefactions to the shrine at Ardabil, which he was renewing, and especially in the role of the librarian. So I'm going to leave it there because I know I've gone on a bit of a while. And